session of Foundations of Judaism. This is the third session on Holidays of History, and really excited to continue this journey with you guys. And so far, we've gone over Hanukkah and Purim, our first session, and now then we did the holidays of the modern holidays of Israel for the most part: Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, Yom HaZikaron. And that was our last session really on the holidays surrounding the destruction of the temple. I guess just without further ado, let me hand out handouts here for you guys, and then I'll share these guys on here. Here, share my screen. Okay. So, holidays of history, holidays surrounding the destruction of the temple. So, I think it's really important to understand what the temple was and is to the Jewish people. And it is really a central part of what it means to be a Jew. Is the fact that we are living in a broken state. We are living in a state that is less than ideal. Let's just say that. Basically, God commands us throughout the books of Leviticus and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, almost all the books besides maybe Bereshit, the first book, to do these things called animal sacrifices. And that really was the major way in which we were to serve Hashem in a ritual manner, right? And to come close to God. So much so that the sacrifices were literally called in Hebrew korban. Korban or korbanot, which are in lakriv is the sacrifice. That's the Hebrew verb to come close, and it is a way of coming close to God and connecting with God. And it was the way most Jews were supposed to connect to God. First, the tabernacle in the desert, which was a sort of traveling temple per se, before the Jews entered the land of Israel. Eventually, that became the temple, the permanent destination in Jerusalem, where God would be worshipped, and this is really the main root of Jewish spirituality that commanded it. And the temple existed. It was built by King Solomon first, and then it replaced the tabernacle. And according to the book of Deuteronomy, we only really can do the sacrifices in the place in which God chooses. And where God chose, according to our sages, is Jerusalem on top of Mount Zion. Because of that, Solomon built the temple. We did the sacrifices there. And it survived like that for many years. I guess probably Solomon was king around 1,000, and so maybe the first temple was built around 1,000, and unfortunately, the temple was destroyed in 586 BC. So it's almost 450 years of temple worship in the temple. It was destroyed when basically when the Babylonians conquered Judea, the southern kingdom. And they destroyed the temple and they exiled the people from Israel in 586 BC. And of course, that was a really traumatic event for the Jewish people because most religions believed that, as long as the temple existed, it was a sign that God was present and that God protected the people and God was real, right? But once the temple was destroyed, that really represented, in most faiths, the end of the religion, right? And it's gone. It proves that God isn't so powerful after all, right? So many people left Judaism after that. The Jews were in exile in Babylon for 70 years until they finally returned back onto the Persians, and we went over this history last time. The temple then was eventually created again in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and built again, and that was called the Second Temple. And the Second Temple lasted until about 70 CE, and was destroyed by the Romans. And was the temple to the ground. And eventually, 135 CE, the Jews out of Israel, fell against the Romans, exiled the Jews out of the land. That was, and yeah, that's what happened. Outside of the land for 2,000 years until the modern state of Israel was created, and the Jews were able to finally have sovereignty once again. There were always Jews that lived in Israel. The land itself was still holy, but there was no Jewish sovereignty there. It was not really safe for Jews there. So until really the state of Israel was created, it wasn't that there was a huge community of Jews in Israel. So in some ways, all of Rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah was redacted, the major document of Rabbinic Judaism and Rabbinic Jewish practice, which is where Judaism comes from. Rabbinic Judaism is, the Mishnah was redacted in 200 CE. So that's, you just do your math, that's 65 years after the destruction of the temple. And so the Mishnah and the rabbis truly was a reaction to trying to continue the tradition, even though the central place where God was supposed to be present and the central assurance that God was with us and cared for us was gone, and it was unable to be built again. The Romans, at least at first, wouldn't let the Jews rebuild the temple again. And eventually the Dome of the Rock was built, and Al-Aqsa Mosque was built in around, I believe, around the 600, the 700s, 800s, something like that. And the Dome of the Rock specifically on the exact site where the temple stood. And of course, the Muslims were in control of Israel for a long time. There was Muslim sovereignty, then it went to the Crusaders, then it went back to the Muslims again. But regardless, obviously, the Muslims would not let us take apart the Dome of the Rock or anything like that to rebuild the Jewish temple. And that's kind of where the status still stands, right? So because of that, we can't sacrifice. We can't fulfill many bits of the Torah, the central way in which we're supposed to grow close to God. Our sages say that the temple was this incredible place where you kind of walked in and you sort of had this palpable feeling of God's presence in a way that we just can't even imagine today. And the rabbis, the sages, did this heroic thing of trying to figure out a way to continue Judaism without the temple. One way they did this was through changing the prayers, changing the sacrifices to the prayers. And that's how we really ended up with prayer in Judaism. Prayer was what the rabbi said you do instead, since you don't have the temple and you can't worship in the way in which God wanted us to. Therefore, you pray instead. And all of our prayer times are lined up with the sacrifices that were offered in the temple. Right, we have a morning prayer because there was a morning sacrifice. We have an afternoon prayer because there was an afternoon sacrifice. I think literally the times are related exactly to the way the korbanot and the sacrifices were offered in the temple. And basically what the rabbis did was say, instead of having one temple where all the Jews are going to worship, you're going to create your own spiritual temple. Each individual is going to have their own temple that they create out of ritual observance, which was super powerful. And my feeling worked really well. And especially if you're an animal lover, it's something maybe you like more than, not that we could ever imagine what that spirituality was of animal sacrifice. But regardless, that really became Judaism. But you have to understand, with Rabbinic Judaism, most Jews left Judaism after this Second Temple was destroyed. Only about 10% of the Jews stayed Jews and followed Rabbinic Judaism. A lot of them became Christian. A lot of them became pagans, and everything else. Because again, temple's destroyed, it's over, right? You have to construct this whole creative force theology of God still cares about us because we're somehow, even though he destroyed his temple, still wants that relation. It's a little confusing. So the rabbis sort of reconstruct this whole system, but with the idea that eventually that we'll rebuild the temple. The second we have a chance to rebuild the temple again, do it because that's what we're commanded to in the Torah, to rebuild the temple and offer the sacrifices in Jerusalem. Eventually the rabbi saw that this wasn't going to happen so soon. The Talmud was redacted in 500 CE, and of course the temple still wasn't rebuilt then. And I think the rabbis began by the Talmudic period to realize that this was permanent, at least not for the way until a long, long time will we be able to rebuild this. So what they did was they really they created a value out of Judaism of remembering the temple and remembering the fact that the temple was destroyed at all times. Even the most happiest moments of our lives, we still remember that we're in a state of sadness and we're in a state of mourning. And that's the state we're still in. So they created fast days and observances. And I shouldn't say the rabbis, it really happened at the time. Jeremiah mentions the fasts over the temple that we still do, for example. To remember the historical event itself of the destructions of the temple, and then also practices throughout our ritual observance to do that. So first we'll go through sort of the days that we really remember the temple being destroyed. Well, actually, we'll do that second. First of all, you should know that there are days. We're going to go through all the days of which you mark the remembrance of the temple. But I think it's a misnomer to think that you're only supposed to be remembering the temple on certain days. Right? Jews, we live in a destroyed state. We live in a state where we're trying to practice our religion, but we are unable to. Okay? In our daily prayers, we say, there's a prayer at the Amidah, we say, I'm sorry that I'm not able to offer the korbanot in the temple. 3 times a day we say this. And we hope and pray to God that you'll accept our prayers, even though we're not able to fulfill your commandments that you commanded us. The sages basically established the special days, but they also established observances throughout. For example, you could skip Shiva, sorry, you're following along in the outline, the Zechar Mikdash observances. For example, when we say the blessing over Bir Hamazon, we say the blessing over the food we eat afterwards after a meal. The first psalm we're supposed to say is Al Naharo Babel Sham Yisham Nadam Bachinu, which is the psalm that talks about crying about the temple being destroyed, that we're in exile, that we're sitting by the rivers of Babylon crying. And again, the reason is because you might be really satiated and feel satiation after you eat, hopefully after you eat a good meal. And at that direct moment of satiation, the rabbis wanted us to understand that you should not feel satiated because the temple's been destroyed. Same thing with buildings, right? We're supposed to leave a brick out of every building you build. Technically, we're not even supposed to have foundations for our buildings because we're not permanently supposed to be here. We're supposed to be in Eretz Israel. We're supposed to be in the land of Israel. And this is just a temporary place to be. Smashing glasses at weddings is probably the most famous example of this. Which is ridiculous now because now everyone just shouts Mazel Tov when they smash the glass, and it's probably the most fun part of the wedding when it's supposed to be the saddest moment of the wedding. That although this beautiful couple is getting together and it's so amazing and it's so wonderful and it's everything, we still can't really be fully happy because the temple's been destroyed. And lastly, there's this observance called Tikkun Chatzot, which is a pious practice to get up at midnight in the middle of the night and mourn the destruction of the temple, to put ashes on one's faces and sing dirges and psalms of sadness, that's another part of the tradition, all to cultivate a continuing state of sadness, a continuing state that no matter whatever joy we have, we can never forget the destruction of the temple, and that creates a lot of darkness within Judaism. It creates a lot of discomfort, and as Jews we're supposed to have that discomfort because we're living in a state where we're supposed to be remembering the laws of the temple. We're supposed to remember to rebuild the temple and eventually hope that the Mashiach will come, the Messiah will come and bring all the Jewish people back to the land of Israel so that we can rebuild the temple and worship God and live in our land. But now, after 2,000 years of exile, this has really been relegated to the times when the Messiah will come back in the end times. Which is unfortunate. That's not really what was supposed to be, but it seems like that's what it is. So that's kind of where we're at with it. So really important. I would say in progressive Jewish movements, outside of Orthodox, what I really mean is for the most part, these practices are sort of pushed to the side because who wants to have a religion that inculcates sadness, right, and mourning and bitterness? And in this modern era, people aren't going to be part of a religion that the major thing in modern society is to be happy all the time. So, this is not something that is obviously a popular ritual these days, but obviously it's something very meaningful to me. I definitely practice. And it's, I think, part and parcel of what it means to be a Jew. Um, so, um, so let's go start going through the days themselves. There's Shiva Sarva Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. This was the day at which um, the Babylonians breached the walls of Jerusalem. Um, Basically, there's another, you can actually go down and write this under the 10th of Tebet. I should have put this in a different order here. I should have definitely put this in a different order, but that's okay. The 10th of Tebet, which is the second to last holiday on the bottom, find out from people online, was the day in which the Babylonians began the siege of Jerusalem. And then it took almost 6 months of siege. They were starving the Israelites, the Judeans, for 6 months. So they couldn't get around the walls of the temple of the city of Jerusalem. Finally, on the 17th of Tammuz, just to go back, the walls were broken. And it took about 3 weeks for the Romans to invade the city, kill everyone, or exile them, and then burn down the whole entire city and temple. So that took about 3 weeks. And then the temple was supposedly destroyed on the 9th of Av, which we call Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. So just starting with I'll let you write for a second because I know you're taking notes here. So let me know when you're ready for me to keep going.
Can I ask a clarification for the order? So the 10th of Tevet, that's when the siege started.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 7th of Tammuz, that's when 17th of Tammuz, that's when the wall was breached.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 9th of Av is the day of the destruction.
Exactly. Perfect. So each of these days are days of mourning. Start with the Shiva Sarva Tammuz because it's first. The days of Shiva Sarva Tammuz and the 10th of Esser of Tebet are done similarly. By the way, so is Som Gedalia. Might as well talk about Som Gedalia. Basically, Som Gedalia doesn't necessarily have to do with the temple specifically, but basically what happened when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem is they first made it a colony, and they established a Jewish governor there named Gedalia. But Gedalia, of course, was very sympathetic to the Babylonians because if you're a conquering army, okay, we're going to suit the locals by making it a Jewish leader, but it's going to be a guy who's going to follow everything. It's a puppet, right? Someone follows everything we say. Unfortunately, Gedalia was assassinated by Jewish zealots. And once Gedalia was assassinated, the Babylonians made the decision that no more Jews can live in the land of Israel. And so that was that really marked the permanent exile and sort of the last chance the Jews had to live in Israel. So that's another day of mourning. These 3 days, Shiva Sarva Tammuz, 10th of Tevet, and Som Gedalia, are known as minor fast days. Not because they're not important, but because they are fast days. They're days in which we don't eat and don't drink from sun up to sundown. Okay? So what we would call them is half fasts in Judaism. Because in Judaism, when we do a full fast, we fast from night to night. Okay, from sundown to sundown, that's a full 24, more like 25 hours. And this we only, fast basically, 12 hours, 14 hours, whatever it is. So that's why those are called minor fasts, not because they're not important, but because they're less than the major fast. So the practice is really on these days, and it's important also on these days to not listen to music, to not go to any parties or celebrations, and to do tshuva. All days of sadness aren't just about sadness. They're not just about, just being sad and dark, but using it so that you could, by realizing what's lacking from your life, you can work to fill that lack on the other case, right? I think if you don't take an honest look at your life and say what's lacking, it's very hard to become a better person. It's very hard so that's what really is supposed to be done on these days. There's special Torah readings to be read if there's enough people fasting, and that kind of thing. Those are the minor fastings. So Gedalia, Tebet, and Shiva Sar B'Tammuz. Shiva Sar B'Tammuz, whence the walls of the temple were breached, begins the period called the 3 weeks of Judaism. And the 3 weeks are the time at which the temple was the time between the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem and the actual destruction of the temple. So during these 3 weeks, the Romans were rampaging through the city, destroying and raping, pillaging, killing, all the horrible things. Probably the worst moment in Jewish history. And because of this, once the 3 weeks begin, after the Shiva Sar Tammuz, after the 17th of Tammuz, we have additional practices that are taken on to again inculcate those make us feel sad. So, for example, we don't attend live music during these 3 weeks. We don't attend celebrations or parties. We don't have weddings. We're not really supposed to go to any happy occasions, and so on and so on. When the month of Av begins, which is 9 days before the Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, when the temple was destroyed, actually, we begin even more intensely. And we stop eating meat, is probably the most known one, and stop drinking wine. So for 9 days, we eat vegetarian and we don't drink wine. And those are the major things that we do. In addition to not hearing live music, not going to parties, not having weddings or whatever. Finally, we have the 9th. Finally get to this 9th of Av. 9th of Av is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar every year. It's a day of utter sadness. It's a day of sadness with no comfort. We're really supposed to embody and let all the sadness of Jewish history come out of that day. And trust me, there's been a lot. So it's believed in Jewish tradition that on the 9th of Av, not only the first temple was destroyed, but the second temple was destroyed as well. And that horrible anti-Semitic incidents throughout history happened on the 9th of Av. For example, a very infamous pogrom happened on that day, which Jews were killed. It's believed that the Spanish Inquisition began on the 9th of Av, when the Jewish community was kicked out of Spain. And worst of all, of course, it was the day in which we believe the final solution was decided by Hitler. So all those occasions are supposedly on the 9th of Av. So we remember all of them on that day. And so it's the day of Jewish communal sadness about all of the horrible things that have happened to the community. And yeah, it's something we don't experience in modern religions, I think, in a lot of other places where you're really supposed to inculcate real sadness and real bitterness and real darkness and live in that without any comfort. You're not supposed to say hello to anybody. You're not supposed to, and as well as the whole day fast, I said, from night to night, there's no sex allowed. There's no putting on cologne or oils. The wearing of leather sandals, which was a mark of royalty back then, and practices like this. So it's really a day. There's not even Torah learning is not even allowed on the 9th of Av because that makes us too happy when we study Torah. So you're not even supposed to learn Torah. Even yeshivot, they play games on this day. They waste the time, because it's a day when you're not supposed to be happy. So yeah, and so it's a day when we read, and specifically the practices on ninth of Av have some more practices. For example, on the night of Tisha B'Av, we usually gather together as a community. We take the parochet, we take the curtain off the ark, the cushions off the benches, turn down the lights, and usually chant dirges called lamentations, or keynote in Hebrew. And we read and hear the recitation of the scroll of Eicha, or Lamentations, supposedly written by Jeremiah after the destruction of the temple. And so that's chanted with a special chant in the temple, and we're obligated to come hear that being read both at night and in the morning. And so the community usually gathers to do that as well. Trying to think of what else. Yeah, there's also practice not to sit on anything, basically. We're supposed to sit very low to the ground like we're mourning. So many people's practice is not to sit on chairs, sleep on the ground, especially not sleep with pillows or comforting objects, to purposely put yourself in a place that's comfort. And again, the whole entire idea of this is just from a spiritual perspective. It's very easy when living in the modern world to say we have everything. We have food to eat. I mean, if you're well endowed, right? You have food to eat. You're safe. Things can be pretty fun in this world, right? Like we don't live such a bad life. So when you're going about your life, it's very hard to feel the sadness and feel the lack of temple not being there. So the point of the ninth of Av is to really inculcate that sadness and realize that we are lacking and we have so much more to grow and so much more to do in this world. And this world is so unredeemed and so broken. And it's really a day of communal tshuva. I always like to say Yom Kippur is the day of individual tshuva, individual repentance, when we fast because we are doing atonement for our own sins. On Tisha B'Av, we're doing atonement for sins of the community because we believe the temple was destroyed because of the transgressions of the Jewish people themselves. The theology is that it was punishment for our transgressions. We don't believe the destruction of the temple was some kind of natural phenomenon, but rather it was a divine punishment for the Jewish people because of our transgressions. And so it is a day of communal tshuva, of thinking of how we can be better together as a community, and just a day of real national mourning, spiritual mourning. It's a really hard day because, especially Siva Sarah Tammuz and Ninth of Av is in the middle of the summer, so the fast is very long, especially if you're in Minnesota. Usually it's Tisha B'Av sometime in late July, early August, or something like that, and it doesn't usually end until 10 o'clock at night, the fast or so. So it's challenging and it's hard. And they're just really hard days. Really, and I think for that reason, for many, many years, lots of progressive Jewish communities didn't want to observe these practices because they felt they were in the promised land. A lot of communities felt, oh, we're in America now. We're free citizens, we're accepted, blah, blah, blah. We don't want to act like we don't have it good, right? We don't want to act like we're not thankful for what we have. And then there's also, of course, feelings of maybe we don't want to build a temple where we're just killing major amounts of animals every day and our connection to God is based on killing things, right? Which is totally understandable. So many of the major movements, including Reform Judaism and somewhat Conservative Judaism as well, took out many of these observances. And for years, they were not practiced except in the Orthodox community. Lately, I would say over the past 20, 30 years, they've started coming back, and especially the conservative one, but also someone in the reform movement as well. And as days of communal sadness, days of communal mourning, days when we can just kind of let it all out. I think in some ways, being a Jew is like holding it in all the time, and trying to be happy and trying to have faith and continue the tradition and do the mitzvot and do what God requires of us in this world and kind of carry the heavy load with joy that God has bidden us to. But on the day of Tisha B'Av, we let it all out. We mourn all the hard things about Jewish life and all of the ways in which Judaism and Jewish community is so broken. And that the temple, and all symbolized by the fact that the temple still hasn't been built. And The idea is supposedly once the temple is rebuilt, the 9th of Av will actually turn into a day of Thanksgiving. It'll be turned into this great, wonderful celebration that we'll have, and all these days will be abolished, and it'll be a day of great celebration. But it hasn't happened in 2,000 years, and we're still waiting. So hopefully you'll never have to observe this. Hopefully the temple will be established very, very soon. But very essential part of Judaism. Look, I think just sort of an overall perspective on this is, I think people in this world are looking a lot in modern society just to be satiated all the time. They just want to be happy. They just want to be satiated. They want to feel like they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and that everything's about giving a pat on someone else's shoulder. Judaism is not about that. Judaism is about saying I always have room to improve. I always need to grow. I want to grow closer to God. I want to get better. I want to be redeemed. I want to become better. I need to become better. How am I going to become better? And to feel shvirat halev, to feel brokenheartedness over the fact that we're not better, both as an individual and both as a community. And cultivating that is a part of essential Jewish practice because it enables us to actually have the desire to become better, cultivate that flame of self growth and communal growth. So I think these days are extremely valuable. That being said, I think it's also important to limit them to when they're limited to, right? It's almost like if you let the cat out of the box, it could take over everything, and you could just walk around in darkness all the time. And I don't think God meant us to be that way either. But rather to reserve this sadness for certain occasions and certain rituals. That's why we have specific days in which we observe this, specific mitzvot, where usually it's where, oh, you might think everything is perfect. Because you might think everything is perfect, we're going to do this ritual. It's going to help you remember that things aren't perfect. You can be happy, but you shouldn't feel like everything is perfect. That's just not what a Jew should feel. And it's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging. It's not a modern concept, I don't think. But this is what God beckons of us. Does that make sense? All right, I think we got through everything. I'm sorry that took faster than I thought. Is there any questions on any of this? Anything I can cover or things that you need clarification on? You can obviously look up all these dates in the Jewish calendar, like Asur B'Tevet's and usually in January somewhere. Tzom Gedalia is always the day after Rosh Hashanah, the fall, and Shiva Asar Tammuz and is in mid-July. It's coming up, and Tisha B'Av is usually at the end of July, beginning of August. But of course, the holidays move around by a couple of weeks because of the calendar. Any questions you have about these things? Anything that I didn't cover or that you have seen before or that you want to ask a question about, since we do have that time?
And you said in the last 25 years or so, these holidays are being celebrated, or celebrated is the wrong word, observed more in the conservative and reform movement. Can you tell me a little bit about what the impetus or what your thoughts on why that is?
I think a lot of people had the same thoughts as I did in terms of the value of sadness and the value of the spiritual value of doing these things, that it's not just to be sad and just to make yourself sad for no reason, like because God said so, but like there's a spiritual reason to do this, that it actually, so I think that's one of them. I think two, many Jews were very uncomfortable with the rebuilding of the temple because of the animal sacrifices and because of all our synagogues would be gone and everything like this, and there would be our Judaism would be uprooted and we wouldn't be able to practice it. And I think that made people very uncomfortable, that like our relationship to God would be based on bloodshed, basically. Really the reform movement certainly, and the conservative movement also really distanced themselves from the temple, and didn't celebrate these holidays because they said they don't believe in, they don't want to rebuild the temple. So why would they celebrate these holidays, right? I think now people are looking back and saying, wait a second, I don't necessarily need to picture actual rebuilding of a physical temple in which we sacrifice animals, but maybe it's a spiritual temple. Maybe this means something much deeper than just building this building again and doing these rituals, which I think also inspired many conservative Reform Jews to come back to this practice. And lastly, I would say it's also a change in Jewish society in America specifically, because American Jews, when they moved to this country, well, Jews before they were American Jews, when they moved here from Eastern Europe and all over the place, in the late 20th century, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Jews were leaving lands that there was tremendous anti-Semitism, and they had no power and lived hard lives. And they were coming to the land of the free. The idea was they used to call this place the Golden Medina, right? The place that the state in which literally they believed in Eastern Europe, the streets were paved with gold. So Jewish immigrants were so thankful that they were here and loved this country. They wanted to forget about everything from the past. They were willing to shed anything to have a good life, to have a life where they were accepted. And so I think for many Jews of this time, they did not want to think about that things weren't perfect. They didn't want to think about the fact that really this too was another stop along the trail of exile. They wanted to say this is the promised land, living as a free citizen with people of other religions and other faiths, as an equal citizen, as an enlightened citizen in a free country. So I think that really, and Jews really wanted to integrate into this country. They didn't want to speak Yiddish anymore. They wanted to like baseball and eat apple pie like everybody else, and they wanted to assimilate. And that's what they did for the most part. But basically, they did it very well. We did it very well. And basically, in the '60s and the '70s, there was the civil rights movement, as we know. But part of this was also the sexual revolution and all different kinds of identitarian revolutions. Not bad to be black power, right? And indigenous power, and all these, that it's good to be this different culture. You don't have to blend into America, and not everyone has to be the same. Everyone can be proud of their identities. That really came in the '60s and '70s. Women's liberation and everything like this, and of course that was wonderful. And so that also, I think, gave Jews the license to say, we have our tradition, we can celebrate our tradition and celebrate our religion, and admit that we're not in a perfect state, that we could pine for Israel and pine for the rebuilding of the temple and a greater world, and that doesn't mean we're any less American, and that doesn't mean we're any less than anybody else. We became less afraid that we weren't going to be able to assimilate or be an accepted citizen in this country. And I think Jews also now are afraid of assimilation. Assimilation used to be a good thing. Rabbis used to talk about how you got to get rid of your accent, you got to stop speaking Yiddish, you got to watch baseball and everything like that, because they wanted to assimilate the American. And I'm really talking about progressive. This is not Orthodox, right? This is conservative reform, more progressive communities. And that really changed. I think that really changed about much later, probably like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when the intermarriage rates were getting really high and still are getting higher every day. And we're losing Jews. And the Jews are losing their connection to Judaism and their ability to observe. And they're becoming so assimilated that they don't even realize people don't even realize they're Jewish anymore. And that scared a lot of people. So I think holidays that are identitarian like this are becoming more and more popular for that reason. Yeah, does that answer your question? It's a little bit complicated because with Jesus, it's always spiritual and it's sociological and it's historical and it's about being American. And it's just, there's a lot. Past tragedy. I mean, it's like, you're not entering when you're dealing with Jews, you're not entering something that's simple. There's a lot of history and trying to figure out how to be this people who are living in exile, but yet proud Americans and loving this country is a really hard balance to walk. And you see it today. I mean, people who call out Jews for voting for Israel first, and should they be American citizens if all they care about is Israel and everything like this? Or if Israel and America fought, whose side would you be on? Right? These are questions that are asked to us all the time, and so we see these questions again coming back, and that's why every time I have an Israeli flag up somewhere, I always make sure I have an American flag next to it, right? So people don't think that I don't, just because I support Israel, I love Israel, I care about Israel, doesn't mean I don't love this country as well. So these are very complicated complicated things. And our observance of rituals changes based on those sociological realities. And look, and truthfully, anti-Semitism has gotten a lot better in this country over the past 150 years, right? Very lately after October 7th, and even somewhat before that, it's getting bad again. But still, even today, it's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s. My dad would get beaten up all the time walking. I've never got beaten up because I was Jewish. My dad got beaten up on a regular basis because he was Jewish walking around Brooklyn where he grew up. And I think that was the experience of many people who are, now are in their 80s or 90s. And the worst I got, someone would throw a penny at me, say, pick it up, Jew, or say effing Jew out the window. My parents would laugh at, my dad would laugh at that as anti-Semitism. That was not it. Getting hit by a shovel and getting sent to the hospital was anti-Semitism because you're Jewish. So I think Jews therefore became less wary about showing public identities, their public Jewish identities, observing these rituals that where people might question them and say, you're not really Jewish, or you're not really American. I'm sorry. Does that make sense? Sorry, this topic makes me a little sad. Again, it's part of my spiritual life, part of my religion. I take this stuff really seriously. Again, it doesn't mean that we can't be happy. We certainly be joyous, but we have to reserve a place in ourselves that marks our connection to Eretz Israel and marks our connection to God, right, and the spiritual matter of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. For me, there's a follow-up question to that. What is it? He's talking about when there are these observances, and then one day the temple will be rebuilt. What is that like when you say, is that like it's literally rebuilt, or is that like you talk more about that? Are there parameters for how do we know when the temple has been rebuilt?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Our rabbis disagree about this in a very short sense, a very simple sense. It's literally building the temple again and restoring the sacrifices and doing the Kohanim serving in the temple again and all this stuff. And that's supposed to happen only under a Davidic king, right? That will restore sovereignty in the land of Israel. So not the state of Israel necessarily, but restore a Davidic king. Now, there are rabbis who have like really maximalist views of this, like a Davidic king, and like the world is restored to perfection, and there's all this, whatever. There's this like really grandiose view of what this looks like, and then there's also much narrower views of what this looks like. Maybe the temple is not a physical place. Maybe it's a spiritual place, and maybe there might not be animal sacrifices there. Maybe it might look like the state of Israel that we have right now, and so there are very liberal sort of figurative interpretations of this and very liberal interpretations of this. And it just depends on which rabbi you're listening to and which text you're reading. But I would say, like, in its most traditional form, it's very rebuild the temple, offer the animal sacrifices on Mount Zion, have it restore the Davidic kingdom. A kingdom, by the way, ruled by religious law, by halacha, right? So there's a lot of problems with the literalist vision. So lots changed over 2,000 years of what you think an ideal polity is and an ideal status is. So it is complicated. And look, let's be honest, we don't know how to do these things. Like, we have Maimonides codified all the laws of the sacrifices that we have them, but no one's ever done them before, like ever. Like, we haven't been sacrificing for 2,000 years. It's a long time, 2 millennia, right? What are we going to get rid of prayer and synagogues and everything we've been doing for the past 2,000 years? Jews don't live in Israel anymore. How are we going to all get to Israel 3 times a year during the pilgrimage holidays? Yeah, over good holidays. So it's pseudo impractical, and I think in some ways that was why it was relegated to when the Messiah comes, like this theory that's seemingly never going to happen. So does that answer your question a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Anything else? Any other questions you have? Any other thoughts? Anything else you want to share? No? Well, thank you again for learning with me today. I really appreciate it. I promise you our next class next week on denominations and conservative Jews in particular will not be as sad. and will be much more joyous. But at least maybe you get the feeling of what's supposed to be going on. Didn't say it's not complicated, so All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Really, really do appreciate it, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.